Hello everybody, it's your pal Gracie here, and if you've been anywhere in the art community on YouTube, you probably know about tutorials. In fact, art tutorials have been kind of making a comeback as of late, and one form of these tutorial videos is something called a process video, similar to that of a normal speed paint video, but the artist is actually talking you through the process and how they go about making a specific drawing. Sometimes it'll be for a whole artwork, and sometimes it's for a specific part. Now, I've always thought this type of video seemed cool, so I wanted to try making one of my own. I do have more than one process of illustrating and painting. It'll vary based on the artwork that I'm working on, but for this one we'll be going over my standard illustrating process. Also, if you've seen my video talking about my comic making process, you might see some similarities between the two. We'll be going over this drawing featuring my character Hope, exploring how it goes from this to this, and the ideas and story behind it. Also, the program I primarily work in is Clip Studio Paint, so there might be some things that I do that can't be done in other programs, but I'll try giving some examples of other things you can do that are similar. And before I begin, I would like to say that everything that I do or suggest is just my personal preference and experience. I know tutorial videos can often frame themselves as if the thing they suggest are rules that you need to follow, and even though I'm sure that's not what most of them are intending, everyone's styles and preferences are different, so don't feel pressured. Also, even though I have been drawing for a while now, I am a self-taught artist, and I have a lot of things to learn still. So consider this as just my 2023 version, and I might update it if things change enough. So let's begin at the start. The first step is basically just me getting the idea for the drawing. Sometimes I'll have to look for different pictures to get some inspiration, and other times I'll just have the idea for it already. Either way, once I have an idea, I quickly make a thumbnail sketch, which are these very loose, small sketches. And I know that my thumbnail sketches are very messy and kind of vague, like I'm literally just drawing stick figures, but I can understand them, so it's fine. It's the exact same thing with my comic thumbnails, but it's fine. Once I made that, I find any references I'll need for things I don't know how to draw, things to get a clear idea of the mood of the piece, as well as the character sheet. What's funny is that most of the time I don't have a clear character in mind when I make the thumbnail sketch of what I want to draw, so it usually takes me a while before I decide which character will work best with this piece. I even have to use a wheel. Sometimes there's this wheel online you can find where you can include pictures into it, and I'll just include all the rough sheets I've made of all my characters, and I'll just let the wheel decide. But eventually I chose Hope for this one. Then I put my thumbnail into my canvas. Here's the size and resolution and DPI that I use for that, and I'll blow it up to fit. Then I have a separate canvas open where I put all my stuff for reference in, and drag that to the side of my main canvas and adjust it to be a little smaller so that way I can focus on the main canvas. You can do similar things in other programs using these things called a reference window, like Minibang Paint and IBS Paint X, and Paint Tool SI has a very similar window feature. With all of that out of the way, it's time to move on to the sketch. For sketching in Clip Studio Paint, I use the one and only, I'm so sorry if I said this right, or wrong I mean, Fude Shinkawa ink brush by Kenyu 05, which is a personal favorite brush of mine, but for other programs I like to sketch with any low opacity or watercolor brush. Now let's sketch the anatomy. And we're done. No, but in all seriousness, there's a reason why I don't usually include the sketching footage in my speed paint, and it's because I'm a bit insecure about how I draw anatomy. I know it's not the best, but I'm slowly getting better at it, I promise. So maybe eventually I'll be able to add more of the sketching process in my videos more often. But I usually use way more layers than I need to sketch the posing, but I merge all the layers eventually. I will say when it comes to anatomy, I usually think of different parts of the body as different shapes, and the gender of the character rarely ever affects how I draw them, because when it comes to different body proportions and stuff, I think about how it relates to the character and not really their gender, which is how I go about drawing a lot of the features of my characters, because, you know, in NB brain be drawing androgynous stuff all the time. But anyway, once I have the sketch of the body figured out, I sketch the eyes and face, and I have a confession to make. Rarely do I ever draw the other eye. When it comes to faces in different angles rather than straightforward, here's what I'll do. I'll draw the eye closest to the viewer, copy it, paste it, flip it, and use the free transform tool to adjust it until it matches the guidelines I've put down. Listen, I know that I've probably just have committed several art taboos, but to that I say I'm gonna keep doing it, and no one can stop me. But also when I draw the eyes, I still keep in mind of the guidelines. I'm still, whenever I'm transforming the other eye, I still make sure that it matches up and that it sticks to the guidelines. Okay, I'm not just going all willy-nilly with it. All right, so just keep that in mind. I do recommend to draw the other eye by hand, but for me, this is just a shortcut I take. Okay, I'm sorry. I do draw both eyes like this when I'm drawing traditionally, so it's not like I can't draw the other eye like this. It's just easier like this. I'm sorry. Once I draw the eyes by committing several war crimes, I draw the rest of the facial features. I'd also like to say the shape of the eyes will also vary depending on what character I'm drawing, but specifically the little end bit here. A lot of the time I'll draw them like this, but I'll also draw them like this with these spiky bits at the end. Sometimes these will be the eyes I give to my girls, and sometimes not. Again, gender hardly ever matters when I draw because I'm an agender maniac, and that's what we do. After I draw the face, I draw the hair, which I do by starting with the bangs and then drawing the rest of the hair by starting at the part of it and the clothes, and then I'll move on to doing a loose sketch of the background. Before merging the sketch layers, I make the layer with the body a lighter color than the rest, so that way I can see the rest of the features clearly. And after all that, it's time for the line art. For this style of illustration, with the line art, I like to use crunchy, hard, textured brushes. So in Clip Studio Paint, I use this brush, which is called the Candela pen, but any G pen or other crunchy brushes will work in other programs. But like I said, I have other illustration styles, so there are other brushes I like to use for my line art, like the same brush I use for my sketch, and I've been experimenting with other brushes too. For the line art, I try not to worry too much with trying to keep it all clean, but I do try to avoid overlap and will often have to make new layers to avoid that before merging it all together. There will be times, however, where I end up not liking something I did in the sketch and completely change it in the line art. This has happened a lot of times when drawing. And when it comes to line art, I tend to try to keep my brush at a relatively small size. With the page size that I'm working with, I tend to keep my brush at size 20 or 25. But for smaller details, I'll scale it down. After I've lined the main parts of the drawing, I'll create a new layer of line art for the face, as well as other things I want to be separate from the main layer. The reason I do this is so that the base coloring will be easier, and if I want to change the colors to be different than the main layer. Finally, I create one last layer, which will be the one I use for some hatching shading, which pretty much is what it sounds like. I create these hatching-like strokes in places I know the shading will be, and sometimes other places. Like these 3 little lines I always put on top of the nose, something I learned from studying the Demon Slayer style, and also some under the eye if they have any eye bags, because eye bags are fun to draw for some reason. This hatching shading technique is one, a helpful guide for me for the rendering part, and 2, just looks really cool. The last thing I'll do, and I'll sometimes do this towards the end, is to color the line art by setting it to alpha lock or lock pixels and applying a dark layer. Now, I actually have a different line art color for each of my characters. So in Hope's case, this color is a dark pinkish red, but it all changes depending on the character I'm drawing. One last thing I almost forgot to mention is I'll also line in and fill the irises on a different layer, making sure to keep it separate from the line art folder. And that's it for the line art. The next thing I'll do is add in the base colors. First, I'll fill the whole thing in with gray, and there's this tool that I use all the time, and you might have actually heard of it if you use Clip Studio, and it's this one. You can download it in the Clip Studio asset library, and it's really helpful. A good way to use it is to set your line art layer or folder on reference like this, and set the tool to reference, so that way it only refers to the thing you set as a reference layer. But I don't always have to do this. If you you don't have Clip Studio, that's okay. Depending on your program, it'll be just as easy. For Medibank Paint and IBS Paint users, what I find best is to select the area outside of the line art, making sure to adjust the pixel expand thingy in just in case, then invert the area and filling the area with a brush. It does work best if you have a hard brush for your line art though, so just keep that in mind. For SI users or users of programs where the Magic Wand tool doesn't have a feature where it can reference things on the canvas, what I recommend is to duplicate your line art, drag it below your main one, and then use the bucket tool. After filling it all in with gray, I create clipping layers for each color I'll be applying: the skin, the hair, and the clothes, etc. I find it easiest to fill in the entire thing with the skin layer first, and then add the color for everything else, which I just do with the bucket tool. The bucket tool in Clip Studio is really good since it has an option to refer to other layers. Medibank Paint and IBS Paint bucket tool work the same. For some things, I need to add gradients, so I set that layer to alpha lock and add it in before I merge all of the color layers into one. Now, you might have noticed that I haven't done anything with the eyes or mouth. This is because I keep that all in their own layers. First, I create a layer on top of my base one, and I fill in the scleras and mouth. Then I'll take the already filled in pupils from before and change the colors to be the base color I need. Then I'll take the eyes colors in one folder, then put the folder and the base one in another folder. And that's all for the colors. Now you might be thinking it's time for rendering, but actually the next thing I'll do is to work on the background. Now I do this step because when it comes to my rendering style, I try to stick to two colors, or at least two hues, one for the shadows and one for the highlights. These colors are dependent on the colors that I use for the background. So before beginning on the rendering, I need to fill the colors I'll use for the background. Now I don't actually paint the whole background at this step or rendering it all completely. That's why this step is called background part 1. I'll usually just fill in the base colors, the gradient of the sky if there's going to be one, and sometimes some more details if they'll be important. Now I did actually add in a bit more detail to this one just so I had a bit of an idea of how I was going to finish it later. Because the water is dark blue and the light is going to be a golden orange color, I'm going to be using dark blue for the shadows and a light golden orange for the highlights in the rendering. However, I did also decide to add a secondary color because there was a second smaller light source. So for that one, I'll be using a lighter blue purple color, although I won't be using this one as much because the light source isn't as strong as the first one. This drawing did actually end up being a good example of the colors I usually use in my artworks, which I like to call sunset colors. Ooh, so pretty, wow. And now it's time to render the character. Now, usually what I try to remember to do first is to add a little blushing to areas like the face, ears, and joints to add some more life and texture to the character. The brush that I use for this is called the Rough Watercolor Brush, which I believe is the default brush in Clip Studio Paint EX. But if not, I'll include a download. I'll actually include a download link to all the brushes that I use in case you want to try any of them out. But most of the time, I forget to do this and only remember halfway through the rest of the rendering process, which I'm pretty sure is the same thing that happened here. So if you're confused, that is why. After that, I make a new multiply layer and use my shading color. And a simple round brush, I put in all of my shadows, keeping in mind the light source. I do this step in a very cell shading way, and a lot of the places I usually add shadows are to push the areas that the light won't reach, the bridge of the nose to add some depth to it, and to separate the sections in the hair. Then I'll use the blur tool to soften up a couple of the edges, which usually just ends up being the bridge of the nose. After lowering the opacity, I then make another multiply layer and choose the transparent watercolor brush, which can be basically any transparent round brush, and I'll actually go over the same areas I shaded before, trying to stay on the edge of the lines of the shaded area. if that makes sense. I don't know. I do this to add a bit of a painterly effect, and I'll also add in any areas that I feel like needed some softer shadows instead of harder ones. I also add some more depth to the nose and around the eye and eyelid, and one of my favorite things to do is to add to a character is to add a bit of eye bags, like I said before. So I'll paint under any eye bags that I already included in the hatching shading to increase the effect. And of course, I also do the same for the hair, staying on the edges of what I put before to add more depth to the sections. Important thing to note is that I don't connect all the sections in the hair, so that way it doesn't seem too stiff. And sometimes some sections will be like way too close to each other, so that also is why I don't connect all the lines. For the last multiply layer, I'll use the rough watercolor brush again to create more depth and shadows and gradients like around the eyes, the side of the body that's getting less light, and the hair, etc. It's a bit hard to explain, but hopefully it's more clear in the actual footage here. I like using the rough watercolor brush more than the airbrush since it adds a lot more texture, but the airbrush also works just fine, and there are plenty of brushes that work similarly in programs like E.V.A Paint and IBS Paint X. Then I lower the opacity, and the last thing before I get to the highlights that I like to use is to create a color burn layer and use the same color I used for the blushing to go over the shaded areas in the skin in order to add more color. And that's it for the shadows. For the first layer of highlights, I'll first create a highlight layer and use a round brush. I add highlights in the hair, under the eyes, and anything metal. For the highlights in the hair, I'll take the smudge tool or the fingertip tool and spread them a bit by just going up and down with my strokes and blur out the spots on the face. Then I'll make another layer, which I'll use for the painterly highlights with the watercolor brush. Unlike the multiply layer though, instead of just trying to go by what I already put down, I'll just paint in any areas that I think will get more light and also in the strands of the hair. After I've painted on everything, I'll make one last add glow layer using the airbrush. I'll go over the highlighted spots to add more glow, like a band of light where I put the highlights in the hair. And now I move on to the eyes. I start with the scleras by shading them with my shading color, and I'll start with a round brush, then I'll blend it out using the watercolor brush and airbrush. Then I'll add a bit of highlight in the sclera by adding a bit of light at the bottom and a little spot over on the side. For the iris, I start by adding a light gradient, then I'll add in the pupil with a darker color and adding in some shapes around it, in this case circles. Then I'll create either a glow dodge or color dodge layer or an overlay layer depending on the effect for the little circle thing on the bottom of the eye. The next thing is something I call the ring light effect, where I'll add this circle of light surrounding the pupil. Then I'll create an add glow layer and glow dodge layer and airbrush some more light. Sometimes I'll usually do this with just a soft airbrush, and sometimes I'll create more distinct circular shapes. At this point, the iris tends to get a bit lost in the sclera because of all the light, so I'll create a multiply layer and paint some shadow around the iris. Finally, I'll add a simple white highlight, which I also like making different depending on the character, and the rendering is just about done. The last thing I'll do is to color the line art if I haven't done that already. put the line art in color in one folder. Then I'll create a clipping layer. For mitigating users, make sure to set the folder to normal before doing this. And then airbrush some shadow over the entire character, making sure to erase the iris or any other area I want to pop out. And also airbrush some extra light. And sometimes I'll also add some room light. I like to do this final touch just to make the shading come together a bit more and add a bit more pop. And with that, the character rendering is all done. Now it's time to go back to the background and finish painting it. Unfortunately, I can't give as much of a step-by-step guide to that because it's always changing based on what background I'm making. Since this background, for one, is just water, I was mainly just experimenting with how to paint it since I don't usually paint water or water ripples. However, I can explain my general thought process with making a background. To start off, I usually go about it in a very painterly way, especially with my normal style. Both so that it makes the character stand out more, but I also find that to just be a really fun way to do it. I also use a bunch of the watercolor brushes in Clip Studio, and I'll basically shade each section or portion until I think it looks rendered enough. This can be a downside though, as there are a lot of times where I'll spend a lot of time on a certain part of a background, but then that'll end up just getting covered up or blurred out later. If you've been watching my channel for a while, you're probably familiar with some of those instances, which aren't great. But I have been trying to get better at that. And for this piece, since the background didn't have any different parts to it, I really didn't have to worry about that. To make the reflection, by the way, I just duplicated the character folder, merged all the layers, then flipped it and transformed it to where it fit right, and used the smudge/fingertip tool again to have it flow with the ripples and lowered the opacity. Now, of course, comes the foreground. Again, it does depend on what the piece is, but I like to add things like light rays and particles, some floating things like petals and other elements and items. In the case of this picture, I almost forgot about these petals in the water that I had sketched out, so I had to quickly paint those in. The foreground tends to be the simplest part if I don't go overboard with it, which I have done plenty of times before. One other thing that you might have noticed while painting in the reflections is I added a bit of red where her arm closest to the viewer. That is for story reasons, but I wanted to go over how I painted that. I basically just took my sketching brush, the brush that I use for sketching, pick the color red, and just blot down a couple of little spots of red, and again use the fingertip tool to smudge that out. It's time to add the final touches. First, I'll go ahead and blur the background a bit and any element I need to in the foreground. Then I'll put everything into one layer, duplicate it, and merge the entire thing to be one layer. You can do this in a couple of different ways in other programs, like exporting the picture first and then importing it as a separate layer. And in IBS Paint X, there's actually a feature to add a layer from canvas or folder, which will basically do the same thing. After doing that, I use the Gaussian blur tool to blur it, use the soft eraser to erase areas like the face, and then lower that layer. This helps me to make sure that the viewer's eyes go to where I want it to, and make sure that anything else is blurred out enough, but not too blurred so that you can't see it still. And finally, I'll make a multiply layer, which I'll use to airbrush shadow like around the edges of the piece, giving a sense of framing. I'll also experiment with different textured brushes depending on the piece. And also as an extra thing, depending on the piece, I'll also experiment with correction layers, gradient map layers, or sometimes even just a simple overlay layer with a solid color if I need to do any correcting with the colors. And after adding my signature, that is it for the artwork. I hope that this was helpful to any of you who are learning to draw or are just curious about my illustration process. Again, I am a self-taught artist, so please keep that in mind. And again, none of the things I suggested are hard set rules that you need to follow at all. And your process will be very different than mine depending on how you prefer to draw and your own style. And I also apologize if this seemed a bit harder to follow. But I did have the speed bank in the background, so hopefully if what I said seemed confusing, you can just look to that if you would like. But yet again, I hope this was helpful. If you like this artwork, you can find more on my Instagram, link below, and check out my comics. If you're curious about my comic making process, feel free to check out that video as well, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye!